Welcome to Talking Feds One-on-One, deep dive discussions with national figures about the most fascinating and consequential issues defining our culture and shaping our lives. I'm your host, Harry Littman.
It's a tremendous honor to welcome to Talking San Diego, Bill Kristol, who has been one of the most influential voices in American political life and thought for the last 35 years. A wonderkind who occupied high-level spots in two Republican administrations. After leaving government in 1993, he became, I think without dispute, the leading figure in American conservative thought, most famously as the founder and editor-in-chief for 20 years of the influential Weekly Standard, the weekly magazine aptly titled The Neocon Bible. But from this perch of really high influence within the Republican Party, Bill was an ardent and early opponent of Donald Trump and co-founder of Republicans for the Rule of Law, among other organizations. And he's been perhaps the most visible former Republican opponent of Trump, which took enormous personal courage and integrity. And has made him, not alone, but part of a small group of Republican voices sounding the alarm against Trump and the current Republican Party. And I think you've helped buck up the shy voices in the Republican Party, Dick Cheney.
Yeah. I'll tell him that you thought he needed my help.
And I'm really proud to say he's become a friend in these last few crazy years. So please join me in welcoming Bill Kristol. Welcome.
Thank you.
Sorry for the hot weather. We're usually more hospitable.
I like the idea of being the Neocon Bible. we did read every once a week, 52 weeks. We read a chunk of the Weekly Standard, completed in 1 year or 3 or 3 years, depending on
like the Torah, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was required at the office.
So let's start a little bit, if it's okay with you, with your early days and your initial embrace of conservative thought. I'm tempted to call you a dyed-in-the-wool conservative because both your parents were prominent conservative scholars. Your mother, Bea, was an American historian. Your father, Bill Kristol, here we go, and generally considered to have been the godfather of neoconservatism and the managing editor of Commentary, really the weekly standard of its day. So, what was it like growing up in that hothouse of conservative thought?
So I would say two things. I mean, my parents, to their credit, were, liked sports and television and Chinese food and all kinds of things like the Jews in New York liked.
Right.
And so it didn't feel like a hothouse. I think some New York intellectuals really relished the hothouse side of being an intellectual. I say they shied away from that somewhat in social life, but also at home, so we had a pretty normal upbringing in the west side of Manhattan. It was an intellectual household. My mom took time off and she my sister, maybe then she was a professor at City University. My father was in book publishing for a while, edited magazines, book publishing, and then taught a little bit, and also basically a magazine editor and columnist for the Wall Street Journal, especially in the 70s, 80s, 90s, where he had probably the most influence and public interest magazine. But I would say this, what's interesting about them, maybe this affected me a little bit, is they were liberals when I was growing up. They were home war liberals, anti-communist liberals, liberals who were critical of the left, often, and of liberalism itself, worried about some defects or problems, let's say, in liberalism. But they were not, on the right the way Barry Goldwater was or Bill Buckley. I'm not saying this critically. I mean, they just weren't, analytically, that was not them. They knew Buckley, my dad, Buckley was friendly, but in a different world. So I grew up as kind of a Scoop Jackson, Hubert Humphrey, Pat Moynihan, Democrat, really, with respect for Republicans. And, I know the Republicans in that case in those days in New York were Nelson Rockefeller and Jake Javits. So it wasn't exactly like, later. And so I think that actually helped me later not to be quite as much a prisoner of, I've been in this party for 30 years, I could never change my views. My father changed his views. He was a big Hubert Humphrey supporter in 68. By 72, he didn't think the government was sound, especially on foreign policy. Looking at Israel and Stanley, and he supported Nixon in 72, and then became pretty consistently a Republican. But again, that the feeling of going through, watching him go through that change, maybe helped me a little, decades later.
Well, you've actually described yourself as having a contrarian streak. So for people who know New York, the cultural tropes of Upper West Side and Mets fan, which you were, I just don't imagine there were many future Dan Quayle supporters among Upper West Side Mets fans at the time.
Well, Mets fan was logical. I mean, my father was a Dodgers fan before they deserted New York to come out to the godforsaken West Coast.
Still chafing about that.
Yeah, totally. He did till he was life. And no, but then the Mets came in as the National League team, so I wasn't contrarian in a sense. I didn't like, the high and mighty Yankees. This was the early 60s. They were the best. They were the Bronx Bombers and all this, and I always sort of rooted for the underdog. And one reason I think I never fit in quite with the Republicans, I'm just telling the truth, is in the 90s, I remember it was when the Yankees had really terrific teams, and they were in the World Series, and I was in the green room, the kind of backstage room for ABC's This Week, which I did pretty much every week. And Trent Lott was the guest, who was a nice gentleman, from Mississippi or whatever, but a very typical Republican. And, turned out he has some stuff in his past that wasn't so great, but whatever. But I didn't know that. Anyway, so we're chatting about, how it is in the green room. He's trying to make conversation about non-controversial things, And so we're chatting about the World Series, literally like that week. So we're chatting about the World Series, and he said, I'm watching it closely. I'm a big Yankees fan. And I thought, really? I said, do you have some New York connection I don't know about? Right. Is there a great New York player who's from Mississippi or something like that? I said, no, I always just root for the best. They were the best when I was growing up, so of course I rooted for them. And I thought it was interesting psychologically, because I had the exact opposite experience of always rooting for the Red Sox or the teams that were the underdogs. And I wonder if that maybe.
And you're a teenager in '69.
Right, and we had a great 69, not to bore you with all sports stuff. Yeah. My last year and a half in high school, the Jets won the Super Bowl, huge upset. Mets won the World Series, which they had been, of course, the worst team in baseball 2 years before. And the Knicks in 1970, Willis Reed hobbled onto the court in the 7th game and defeated the hated Los Angeles Lakers. So this is great.
That's great.
I almost never could watch sports after that, because it was like, when are you ever going to have a better year and a half than in the three sports you care most about? Your team wins the world championship in an upset.
What was your Jewish life like as a kid?
So my parents were well educated, I would say, in things Jewish, and it was an important part of their identity, certainly. We weren't conservative at home, but my parents, they were conservative enough that they didn't like some of the liberal synagogues on the Upper West Side, a little too much tikkun olam, a little too little actual talk about Judaism, and so I went. I can't really remember how to say. I mean, I know what happened. He sent me, but I ended up at the Spanish Portuguese synagogue, Church Israel, which is a very old and grand Orthodox synagogue in 70th and Central Park. It was the first synagogue, first or second synagogue in the U.S. in Newport, and it was the one that the Spanish Portuguese Jews who were left Spain and Portugal came 1492 and went to Amsterdam, and they came over in 1630, 1640, founded it further down Manhattan, but this was the heir to that synagogue. Very old-fashioned, just a Sephardi synagogue, where if you were called to the Torah, you wore a top hat. Because you couldn't go just wear a kippah. Needless to say, the women were upstairs and you couldn't be called anything. So, we didn't observe at home. Honestly, we didn't even really keep kashrut or anything. But I went to this synagogue, so this was also part of my weird upbringing.
I'm going to take the iPad out.
I don't know what exactly, but so I went to synagogue with a lot of people who were genuinely Orthodox Jews, and I, so of course, was respectful of it when I was there. But so that was I had a bar mitzvah like everyone else after their bar mitzvah. I sort of drifted away, but it was always important to me. I mean, my mother had gone to the Jewish Theological Seminary way in the late 30s when she went to college. Kind of unbelievable. She went to Brooklyn College. Some people here in New York, right? Yes, seems so. And she went to Brooklyn College. She lived in Brooklyn. She lived at home. She didn't have any money to live in college or anything like that. She took the subway to Brooklyn College. Went home to Bensonhurst. Then took the subway to the JTS, which is next to Columbia, in Upper Manhattan. So we're talking like an hour subway ride. And I remember saying to her, and then an hour back home. And she said it was good, we should just go all the work done on the subway. And it was no problem. But anyway,
And her dad's a rabbi, is that right? Or
no, she was.
One of you immigrants? Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about this word. Her family was kind of was observant, and her father was a.
It looks like it's really well posted.
Depression. They made it through, kind of very small businessman in New York. But her side of the family was more intellectual, or at least claimed that there was a great tradition of rabbinic, leadership and thought back in the old country. It was very unclear that this was true. There was no evidence of this, but that was kind of the family lore. Whereas my father's family, he was also from Brooklyn, and they met as young Trotsky amusingly, and in high school, and when they reached 16 or something like that. His family was not observant, more of a kind of Buddhist, sort of politically Zionist. Socialist.
I'm getting off the mic. I'm going to go talk to Jordan.
And many of his relatives, I later discovered, were, slightly on the dubious, not quite criminal, I would say. I don't think they were ever convicted.
They might have known my grandfather.
But I mean, they were, a couple of these uncles, I remember this at our wedding. I didn't really know this. He wasn't quite as close as Mom died young. He wasn't as close to his family, but his father was very close to, but I'm moving out here in LA. But he was Taylor, that's my grandfather. My father said a couple of uncles worked in, they ran the projectors at movie theaters. It's like unless you're 70, unless you're my age, you don't even know what that is. But yes, the movie theaters used to have these projectors with rolls of film, right? And that was apparently a notoriously mobbed up union, right? It was like all kinds of mafia connections. I didn't know this to the projectors union. Two of my father's, then I got interested in this the way I went to teach did in the 90s in school and kind of looking up genealogy and stuff, and they found when the grandparents came to Ellis Island and so forth. And one of our kids, I can't remember which one, found the at the time.
Hey, Armand, Jordan O'Cree giving
just be online, obviously, of second cousins or something like that, of my father and his father. He bumped off in a mob hit in Brooklyn in 1936, which I missed when our son, since he was really thrilled by it.
Yeah, exactly.
He didn't care that my father was a pretty well-known intellectual. He didn't care that his grandmother was a distinguished historian. He didn't care that I
have all the mics here.
He bumped off in a mob hit. That was really fantastic.
Yeah. All right, I promise we'll fast forward soon.
Yeah.
No. I wanted to, because I again, it's sort of discussing your, early intellectual life. I don't want to skip over Harvard, where you arrived a year after, I think, the university hall's been occupied, and it's, just a pretty wild-eyed spot, and you were self-identified, right? I read something about the Spiro Agnew T-shirt and stuff. Can you just tell us a little about those days?
Just troublemaking. No, I mean, I used to say that I think I rebelled against my peers who were New Left, types, certainly in New York and then at Harvard. And I agreed with my parents who thought the New Left was a bad place for liberalism to have gone and were anti-communist and so forth, pro-Israel incidentally, which was an issue after the '67 teacher strike in New York. So I got to Harvard, and but I was still sort of on the Democratic side, so I volunteered for the Scoop Jackson for President campaign, the senator from Washington State, kind of a great, old-fashioned, liberal, anti-communist, great friend of Israel, actually, in '72. First of my many very successful campaigns. I think he ran 6th in the Massachusetts primary, behind Wilbur Mills or something like that. So, and I remember then in the general election, to give you a sense of Harvard at the time, as people know how bad the campus, not bad, how one-sided the campuses could be these days. At Harvard, and then Harvard Crimson did a poll of the student body in October of '72, and I was for Nixon in the general election, partly because of Israel, and I think the poll showed that the Harvard students were 92% were for George McGovern, who I liked very much, of course. 5% were for the Black Panther candidate, Eldridge Cleaver, and like 2.6% were for Nixon. So that was my So, but I will say also that the mood, I was not persecuted. I had a good time in college. Students were more, I think there's more of an atmosphere of tolerance and of respecting other people's points of view back then. And I was in the faculty, which was overwhelmingly liberal at Harvard, also very much that, they liked having someone in class who would argue with the other students. I'm not so sure that's the dominant mood now on many campuses,
Okay, and then of course you got a PhD pretty quickly at Harvard and became an academic, really. You were at Penn, and that was the life you thought you were settling into, yeah?
Yeah, I taught at Penn. I taught most of political philosophy. It turned out not to have the patience or maybe the intelligence to really be a serious student of these deep works. And so I taught at Penn for a few years, kind of a mess there anyway. The department was kind of a mess. My wife, meanwhile, got a PhD in classics, and actually we were very lucky. She got a job in classics at Penn too, so we were in good shape in that respect. But then I got offered a position at the Kennedy School back at Harvard. I went there for 2 years. That was more practical, public policy school. They encouraged people to go to Washington to learn what government's really like. I really hadn't worked in government. I worked on the Moynihan campaign in '76 in the summer in New York, so that was politics. So I went to Washington for a year, worked in the Reagan administration, in the education department, and like many people, not Harry, but like many people who go to Washington, it's now almost 40 years later, and there I am. Washington is full of people who came to Washington for a year or two and somehow stayed. But it turns out it's a nice place to live, and if you're lucky enough to be able to make a living there, it's a nice place to bring up kids, actually. So we've enjoyed Washington.
But, I mean, you were, I think, sort of unusually, you remained a sort of intellectual force, or very thoughtful, but when you were in government, the expression, the size, that politics is blood sport in Washington, and you were a player, right? You fiercely opposed Clinton health care, you fiercely defended Dan Quayle, strongly supported the Iraq War. In other words, you were not just an intellectual on the sidelines when you were there, right? Fair enough?
Yeah, fair enough. And I'd say one of the things I learned from studying political philosophy, and I'd say it's very true of the thinkers I like the most, some of the classical thinkers, Aristotle and stuff like Burke and others, Tocqueville, was that politics is different from intellectual life.
Right.
Philosophy doesn't mean that all no holds are barred. It doesn't mean that politics is without its own kinds of principles. But you can't just go and sort of mechanically apply, your thoughts about everything. And politics is a matter of working within the system to some degree or changing the system. So I think I, in a way, learned that in the academy, and I liked Washington. I liked politics. I was very lucky to have good bosses in both Bill Bennett, whom I went to work for, and then Dan Quayle, really a nice man, and I was lucky to be in the White House at a pretty young age, and then I became chief of staff after a few months, so that was exciting. I was senior staff level and all that. So I had an exciting, I guess, basically 7 years in the last half of the Reagan administration, and the entire George H.W. Bush administration, until he was unfairly voted out by the voters. After, if I might say, quite a successful term as president, winning the Cold War, some minor things like that, passing a bipartisan budget deal that ended up producing a budget surplus, the Clean Air Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Not that I'm bitter. But
you made it very...
The Cold War ended. Actually, it shows in a way both the good, right? The Cold War ended. The voters looked at Bush. He'd been, obviously, Reagan's VP. He was 12 years in office. You guys did a great job, Reagan and Bush. Thank you for, the Cold War ended peacefully and successfully, I think one could say. Did some other good things. Now we want someone 20 years younger who's focused on domestic policy. And Clinton, who was a very effective candidate, obviously. So it was a good lesson for me, actually, that, you can be a good president. It doesn't mean that the voters will reward you. And it's not entirely irrational of them to say, well, that was nice, but now we're thinking ahead. And Clinton Gore is kind of the better team to bring us to deal with the post-Cold War world. So,
and a lot of people in D.C., when they leave government, they kind of go back and forth or to law firms. And we don't have time to cover this, but you kind of went into an exile of a sort and started. You for what became for 20 years really the leading conservative magazine in the country. Fair to say?
Yeah, Bill Buckley had started National Review, and he had actually stepped down from it, just about at the end of the early 90s. And that was a bi-weekly. It was in New York, and that was much more and I respect Buckley hugely, and I respect National Review. But it was much more of a kind of orthodox, conservative, Barry Goldwater, Reagan, even at the time, magazine. We were more neoconservative, as they say, kind of a little more McCain Republicans as opposed to, sort of really conservative Republicans, very hawkish on foreign policy. And so, yeah, it had its own voice, I think, for those 20 years. And we were at odds with the Republican Party and the conservative establishment some of the time. I remember Bob Kagan, who's written excellent books I highly recommend on American history and American foreign policy. He has a new one that's very, very good, actually, on more on the Trump phenomenon and authoritarianism. But Bob and I wrote several pieces, a lot of pieces together, and we wrote an editorial in December of '95, so 3 years after we started the Weekly Standard, defending Clinton's decision to send troops to Bosnia to fight to save the Bosnians and others from Milosevic, and criticizing the Republicans who had already, as they often do in a kind of proto-Trump moment, were sort of saying this is, you shouldn't intervene, leave them alone. It sounds a little like the Ukraine stuff today. And it was unclear where the Republicans were going to go. Luckily, McCain and Dole and others dominated the party at that point, so most Republicans ended up going along. But I remember writing this editorial, which praised Clinton for a little belatedly, but going in, and we had 1/5 of our original subscribers canceled their subscriptions. I didn't subscribe to this conservative magazine to read editorials praising Bill Clinton. It's like, I remember Bill Buckley's famous answer, wasn't it? When the National Review, when people didn't like something he would write, I think when he turned up, when he criticized the John Birch Society and stuff. Cancel my subscription, Mr. Buckley. And Buckley famously wrote back, cancel your own goddamn subscription.
All right, so I think we've established your impeccable conservative credentials. So let's fast forward to 2014, or if you like, 2015, the fateful ride down the escalator. You were an immediate strong critic of Trump, in that very first time, and saw it as a break glass moment, and you were a pretty isolated voice then, right? A lot of people saw him as kind of a buffoon, or thought that if elected, grown-ups would come and would run the place, but you were immediately alarmed. Yeah, what did you see that others didn't?
Yeah, there were a lot of people who were alarmed then. I mean, National Review, which I mentioned, had an issue with 25 articles against Trump in January, February 2016, when it was sort of still looked like there was a chance to stop him for the Republican nomination. I think someone did a count, and 20 of those 23 people ended up being okay with Trump, certainly by 2020. A few of us, Jonah Goldberg and I and one or two others, held the line. I guess I saw a couple of things. I didn't agree with him on a lot of policies, obviously on foreign policy, on trade, on immigration. I thought there was an ugly nativist and isolationist and America First side. I remember when he used the term America First in 2016, and I thought, well, he doesn't know anything about that, I guess. Maybe his father had been sort of involved a little bit. And someone told him it sort of was a good term to use, but how crazy is that? This is one of the most discredited movements, really, in American history in the 20th century. I mean, America First, and then I did look, America First was started in the summer, early fall of 1940, after France had fallen, during the Blitz, after, it wasn't like started in 1936 by people who didn't quite understand what was happening yet. Everything had happened, Kristallnacht and the invasion of Poland and the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And so it was pretty deservedly discredited, and it fell apart, obviously, after Pearl Harbor. And the idea that I thought, well, this is just how foolish of it. But it turned out, actually, I hate to say it, they sort of knew what they were doing, right? That's their policy, this kind of a version of America First, isolationism, nativism, hostility to foreigners, and so forth. And so I saw all of that, I think, and I took it a little more seriously maybe than some other people. And then I just saw his character. And there, maybe I helped a little by having a lot of friends in New York and knowing people who had dealt with him.
Oh, right.
And it just seemed ridiculous he shouldn't be president. Whatever you think, and I really thought about this a lot since everyone thinks the presidents we've had really in our lifetimes, if I can speak how old most people here probably, but there's been a mixed bag, and they weren't all perfect by any means. But I'd say the presidents, and even the candidates who lost the presidency, were like respectable people. I mean, Romney and McCain and Dole, Clinton's, it's like personal foibles, but Gore, Bush, I mean, none of them was like Trump. None of them was a pure demagogue who was just willing to say anything if it went over well. They all had some sense that on serious stuff, you've got to put the country first. Maybe you're going to campaign, you're going to go honestly, and you promise things you can't do, or you attack your opponent for things he's not really quite responsible for. But in the crunch, ever since World War II, I would say really, our presidents have been pretty, and their opponents have been pretty responsible. Eisenhower, Stevenson, Kennedy, and Nixon, and so I just thought you can't risk having someone like Trump as president in a dangerous world, and I didn't think he would win, and he won the Republican primary.
You didn't think he would win?
No, I didn't think. I thought I read an editorial about 3 weeks after he came down the escalator, saying, "Of course, we can never support Trump." I said in the editorial, I will say, however, that he's hitting core. We should be careful because he's tapping into something that the other candidates aren't. So I did sort of see that there was, unfortunately, more of a chance that he would do well. And it was sort of flukish that he won. Obviously, he had a divided field. He was lucky to have Jeb Bush as his main opponent. I like Jeb Bush, but the idea that you would have Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton or like rerun another Bush, you'd be like, that's like the third Bush and the second Clinton, and that's fresh, Americans like new, fresh people, and then it's like really the brother and the wife, the brother and son on the one hand, and the wife of the former president on the other. It was kind of, I think it ended up hurting Bush a lot, just the notion that was going to be the choice. Anyway, he won the primary, and then everyone assumed he would lose to Hillary Clinton, and he got kind of lucky and squeaked through on the Electoral College, so there we were.
There you were. Okay, but I want to focus now, you said, in the circumstances we were in, because it's my best guess, but let's just pause it for this question. That there's always he's a first-rate demagogue, but they're lurking here and there at any given time. What was it about the circumstances, the political, wherever we were economically, the United States position that actually was so well bedded his efforts and made him able to make it?
So I'm sure dissertations are being written on this, will be written on it, and there are a million things. I would say we have had demagogues, many demagogues in American history. George Wallace and Joe McCarthy, Huey Long, and Henry Wallace, I would put in that category on the left, and so forth. Demagogues were really foolish people in some ways, like Wallace. But they never quite made it to the presidency. We had governors, we had senators, Wallace vice president, and that really makes a huge difference. I mean, having a demagogue as president changes everything. And I do think that's where people, I had that sense that we have only one, it's not like prime minister, it's the head of a government, it's not really, he has peers, president's the president, right? It's the only person we all vote for, kind of every 4 years, and nationally, vice president. And so I did think it was very having a demagogue as president is something we had thankfully escaped pretty much in American history. And we know from the history of other countries in Europe and Latin America and elsewhere how much damage a demagogue could do. And the founders were very aware of this. When you read the Federalist Papers,
that's right.
Really? They go on and on about it.
All of them.
Yeah, we gotta have. There's always a danger of demagogues. But one thing, they say this in those papers. They can happen in a state. States are small. You can have a demagogue run a state. But thankfully, we have this extended republic. We have the Electoral College. We have sort of checks and balances. We're very unlikely that person could become president. So why he succeeded? I mean, I think there were. Well,
leaving him aside, what was it about
two kinds of things. One, I'll come back to this in a second. Deeper problems in the Republican Party and in the country in a way that he tapped into. He also was very lucky with the time. Everything, was a perfect storm, right? In 2015, when he runs, he is a smart demagogue in the sense that he doesn't believe anything, and he was willing to test all kinds of irresponsible things. People would say afterwards, Trump saw stuff that Jeb Bush didn't see. People were really upset about immigration. Jeb Bush, believe me, was governor of Florida with a wife who's from Latin America. Jeb Bush knows that there's a lot of bigotry against Latinos and a lot of hostility to immigrants. He just wasn't willing to pander to it. It wasn't like he didn't see it. But to be fair, I think Barbara Rubio wasn't willing to pander to it at that time, and even Ted Cruz, who's on the right wing, wasn't willing to, and Bobby Jindal, all these other candidates, and Trump was just willing to go there. Mexican judge. I'm being persecuted by a Mexican judge. who is this Mexican judge? He's a guy who was born in Indiana, whose parents were from Mexico. But that's like, what American politician, except for really Joe McCarthy types, or I'd say Southerners in the heyday of the early 20th century, the heyday of Jim Crow and racism, were willing to really play that kind of pure ethnic or race card. And then the Muslim ban. And then in 2015, people forget there was a lot of terror. There was terrorism in Europe. There was the thing in San Bernardino, was in October, I think, of 2015, had a huge effect on the race. The migration crisis because of Syria, and Fox News every day was scenes of migrants sort of swarmed, looking like, shown in a way that made it look like they were kind of destroying every city in Europe and impossible. And Trump sort of managed to conflate that in people's minds. So and then there was Iraq, which was a failure, obviously, of elites in retrospect. And the '08 financial crisis. Now, you could argue by 2015, we were long out of Iraq. We were fighting ISIS, but not with any great American casualties. No one was against that, really. We were recovering adequately, honestly, from the financial crisis. Still, I think that had been a blow to the system, to people's confidence in elites. And all those, factors, I think, added up. And the deeper thing was, I do think people like me, we just thought we were beyond racism, if I can put it this way, beyond nativism. And we didn't see stuff in the country, but particularly in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement, that was there beneath the surface. Or if we saw it, we fought it. I mean, to be fair to us, I was very much against Pat Buchanan and fought him throughout the 90s. I was against Ron Paul. There were others like that. But we defeated them. Buchanan got some votes in Iowa and New Hampshire, and he looked like he was a formidable candidate, and then Dole became the nominee. Ron Paul, people forget this, didn't tie, in one of the early states in 2008, and then John McCain became the nominee. And John McCain, in the debate with Obama, famously said, you shouldn't, it's not appropriate for you to criticize him because it wasn't his real religion, but he called him Muslim and so forth. And so I thought, and then Romney and Ryan in 2012, whatever you think of them, they're decent human beings and not bigots and so forth. So I guess, I think it's not quite fair when people say you guys were just blind to everything out there. We knew there. I mean, I went to a lot of Republican events over 20 years. I knew what was going on to some degree out there beneath the surface, but I underestimated it. I thought it had been sort of dealt with. And I underestimated how a skillful demagogue who was willing to abandon all the constraints, it wasn't any kind of dog whistles with him, it was just flat out, appeals to bigotry, really, and nativism and other things. I underestimated how powerful that would be.
I want to stick with some of these forces for a little bit more. And so here's what in 2022 you tweeted: you can't overestimate how much damage the capitulation of conservative and Republican elites has done. Trump by himself succeeding was bad, but the GOP and conservative establishment legitimating and rationalizing and enabling Trump created the very dangerous situation we're in. And so let's say that's true. Also posit that they are as bad, no worse, no better than any 100, politicians over a certain time. What was it, other than, unless you think it really was simply his singular charisma, that made them knuckle under in a way that previous, public servants would not have done?
No, look, it's a good. It's a very important question. I mean, we didn't really have the test case of someone like that becoming president and then using his power as president to reshape the party, to purge people, to support primary candidates against people who work with him. And he was pretty, in his own kind of chaotic and crazy way, forceful in doing that. He wasn't willing to say, look, I'm president, but the party's a big party, like Reagan, but there's Mark Hatfield and Pat Wood, and there are moderate Republicans from other states, and then I'm on the conservative side, but this is a big tent, and Trump did not have that answer. Republican dissidents. Some of them left, Paul Ryan left, and so gradually the better ones left, and Trump was left in charge. But I think it's a very important point, just that Trump by himself would have done damage. But Trump as let's call him a sole demagogue as president, would have done damage. Presidents are powerful. But I think if the party had stood up, And if the congressional leadership and the Republican side had stood up against him, and the conservative establishment had really stood up against him, the Wall Street Journal editorial page and so forth, and not just occasionally say, well, I'm really a little unhappy about this thing he said the other day. But at the end of the day, the Democrats are worse because they're more dangerous, because they're a bunch of Marxist lunatics and so forth, and capital gains rate might go up 2 percentage points, and that'll be the end of Western civilization, and all that. I mean, the degree to which the capitulation of the conservative elites and the Republican elected officials made Trump so powerful can't be overestimated. I mean,
and
he could have been a one-term,
right?
yes, I mean, he could have been a one-term parenthesis, is the way I think of it. Kind of wacky, unfortunate, and maybe like, I don't know, Jesse Ventura is not a fair example because he wasn't a mean-spirited guy. But, a weird governor of Minnesota for 4 years. He didn't do that much damage, so far as I can tell, visiting Minnesota. I mean, I don't know, maybe Minnesota's never been the same. I don't know who would know, But and other states have had sort of oddballs occasionally or whatever. Or even take Joe McCarthy, a much more serious guy who did real damage in his 4 or 5 years and shaped the Republican. But, once he was defeated, and Eisenhower was able to defeat him basically in the Army McCarthy years. 5 years later, 10 years later, I don't know, you could write the history of post-World War II American politics, and McCarthy's kind of
maybe 2 years later.
Yeah, so that would have been possible, I think, but the capitulation to him was terrible. I tried to recruit people to run against him in the primary in 2019, not thinking he could be beaten, but thinking like Gene McCarthy in a way in 67 in Vietnam, that at least it would show resistance and it would lay the groundwork later on if he lost. Couldn't get anyone really serious to run against him. Then he runs, he mismanages the pandemic. It's one thing after another. And he almost wins. I mean, he came pretty close to catching Biden, obviously. The Republicans gained seats in the House. They held the Senate. And so suddenly the story wasn't this guy's sort of ruined the party's future. It was this guy's actually been a pretty successful candidate. He's more successful than McCain and Romney, One of the biggest mistakes liberals made, I think, but some of the never Trump people, not I think me in this case, made, was thinking, he's such a disaster. It's going to blow. He's going to, destroy the Republican Party. Everyone who signs on with Trump, this is something Harry and I talked about, is going to be discredited. Their future's ruined. I remember having arguments with people about this in 2017, 18. Idiot Sean Spicer and Sarah Sanders, all of his press secretaries, and the people who would apologize for him. I mean, how embarrassing is that? People would say, which it was. And I remember thinking, I don't know, it is, but are we confident that they won't end up making a lot of money on Fox or on right-wing versions of Fox or on social media? Sarah Sanders, who was a laughingstock when she was Trump's secretary, is the governor of Arkansas. People have done well being Trumpists. And that's bad, because it meant all the incentives then for other people was, well, you know what, if he was the nominee twice, then January 6th happens. And I thought, okay, maybe finally, for about 2 days, I thought that really we could get rid of it. That would be the end. It was such a disgrace and such a dangerous thing, obviously. And I thought other people would go the way Liz Cheney had gone, Adam Kinzinger. And I remember talking to Adam Kinzinger the weekend after January 6th and saying, how many votes will there be for impeachment in the House next week? 50, 60, 70? I guess we're not going to get a majority, but could we get almost a third and a half? That would really be important. And Adam said, I thought we might get 50 2 days ago. Now, I think it does. And I remember I just couldn't believe it, actually. I knew a lot of these people, and I knew what they thought of Trump. And for a day, they had said this is beyond unacceptable, and he could never be president again, and we need to separate the party from Trump. 10 votes in the House out of 200, I think, House Republicans, 1 week after January 6th. And then the Senate was a month later, and 7 votes to convict out of 51, about 49, I guess, Senate Republicans.
And McConnell, the one moment.
Yes,
it could have been.
They could have. So the failure to be serious about January 6th then created a permission structure where at least Stefanik, who worked for me incidentally in Washington 15 years ago, she worked for Paul Ryan. She was like a very normal, young Republican, quite smart actually. And so at least Stefanik decides, I'm going to just characterize the voters in the way that I think it's true, I don't know this, decides, you know what, the futures have dropped now with all these people. Now with Paul Ryan, he's retired, he's doing some Wall Street stuff and all this, and I'm just going to become a huge Trump champion, and then everyone else goes in that direction. And then and then it's like maybe he won't win the nomination because DeSantis or someone, Nikki Haley, will stop it. That quickly he disposed of that. He's not a talented politician in some way, you know. And now he is the first Republican in history to be nominated 3 straight times. The only presidential candidate, apart from Roosevelt and Nixon, I guess, with 3 nominations in the last more than a century. This is kind of a horrifying fact. Just horrifying here. Trump has gotten more votes because the population is so much greater today. Has gotten more votes for president than any other human being in American history. So isn't that kind of horrible? I mean, really, you know, it's like Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, you know. So, the point is, the Republicans won the House 2022. For all that I worked on some of this, we defeated some of the craziest election deniers in Michigan and Pennsylvania and other states. Carrie Lake did lose in Arizona, but by like 20,000 votes, you know. And so the upshot of all this is that we have a demagogue as head of one of our 2 major parties, the presidential candidate for the 3rd time, 50-50 in the polls. That is really dangerous. And that is that's because of Trump's skill, I guess you could say, to some degree, and a little good luck maybe, but it's really because the whole party just has never been willing. There were several moments when they could have stood up to, obviously, 2016, the first impeachment in 2019, 2020, obviously January 6th especially, but also the indictments in 2023. I mean, the guys take classified documents down to Mar-a-Lago. Maybe that would have just say, look, you know, I respect you. Could say, it's not like me. They could have, I respect Trump. He did good things for the country. You know, he was better than Hillary. But no, I think it's time to move on. But none of them. It's not even like, some people said that. Very few said it. And
You've been a pretty
Nikki Haley sort of said it, but that's just supportive, of course, right? So.
Yeah, you've really been a lonely voice with a lot of people, old friends on the other side. So that's the party. I want to keep on with one almost Marxist, I don't know, kind of analysis you did that also really struck me. So this is in an interview with Greg Sargent. You said, we've seen it in history before, economic elites deciding to pursue their self-interest, very narrowly understood, combined, and this is the part that kind of interests me, with the populist exploitation and intensification of grievances and anxieties, and frankly, bigotries and prejudices. So, the suggestion is like the big part of the Trump, MAGA contingent, sort of what we always think of any non-college educated whites, are sort of been hoodwinked by, this is, it does have a kind of Marxist feel to it, but do you think that's, discussed?
Yeah. No, look, I think everyone has agency, so I don't like it when we treat all these people because they don't have college degrees or fancy college degrees, and they're not responsible for their decisions. They're grown, they can decide if they want to live in a country shaped by Trump's policies and to support Trump and to imitate Trump, which a lot of them do now, obviously, rallies and vote for other politicians who imitate Trump or not. So I'm against depriving them of agency. Having said that, I think there's been probably too much emphasis, I'll put it in shorthand that you'll look at, on the Fox News side of Trumpism, and not enough on the Wall Street Journal editorial page, a combination of that. Because I don't think Fox News couldn't do it by itself. That's Pat Buchanan. That's George Wallace. That's 25% of the vote. That's a lot of troublemaking, a lot of bad effects, that it's not healthy for the country necessarily, but that doesn't get you the Republican nomination 3 times in a row. That doesn't get you to raising hundreds of millions of dollars. That doesn't get you to be able to control Congress the way he's been able to. And that, I think, is the accommodation of the elites, which is due to various things, but one of the obvious ones is just that he gave them, he's not stupid, he is one of them, first of all, on the economic side, and he gave them what they wanted. He gave them a totally non-populist tax bill, and he gave them no regulation if they were in good terms with him personally or with some of his cabinet officers, or less regulation. And it turns out that all these people who love free markets, they probably ultimately, if they have a choice, maybe they do prefer free markets. But if it's going to be a situation where this guy could win, they want to be on his side. I've been very struck by that in 2024. I personally had this discussion with several people I've known and used to be friendly with, and who, I sort of, they run businesses, and they, look, Trump could win, right? I said, yes. I can't afford. I got, 2,000 employees. I can't afford to just put them all at risk. Trump will go after us if I oppose him. And, we did pretty well in those first 4 years. And the country wasn't ruined, and they kept them in the guardrails were in place. Then they have all kinds of rationalizations about how it's not so dangerous. So the refusal to realize that the next Trump term would be much more dangerous, for pretty obvious reasons, I think, than the first one was. The guardrails aren't still in place. You're not going to have H.R. McMaster and even John Bolton and even Bill Barr, who didn't like very much, but still people who would not go the last mile in Trump's authoritarian plans. They're all gone, and they're not getting back in. And so it's going to be the worst kinds of people we saw in those last 2 months when he tried to overturn the election results. But the business types, it's sort of, it worked out okay that first time, wasn't disastrous. NATO still existed after 4 years, except there's no war in Ukraine, and that's not a huge issue for the future of the global order. But anyway, yeah, so they liked the economic policies. And Trump was smart that way, clever, right? He understood how much, just as little, they were already extremely wealthy, a lot of these people, but somehow they can't resist the allure of, a little more of a tax cut or something.
Little handout of freebies and stuff. Okay, so now we're where, so we're in the present day. You've written and you just kind of explained and gotten us here that if he's reelected, it'll be far more dangerous than we have ever seen before. So you were just explaining, what do you mean by the guardrails are gone?
So I'd say, he's got, when he took over in 2017, he really hadn't expected to win. He didn't know really what he was doing much. He has some really bad people in the White House, Steve Bannon, for example, who really are authoritarians and, bigots and stuff and corrupt. And it was a very corrupt first term and had all kinds of bad things that happened. But it was also chaotic, and there were a lot of people there who thought it was their task to keep him from doing certain things. I remember writing a piece when McMaster went in and then Kelly became chief of staff, sort of defending them for going in against some of my never Trump friends who thought you should refuse to work there. And I think, if you can be Secretary of Defense and stop them from doing some really irresponsible things, it's probably worth it if you can avoid legitimizing the worst things. And I think Mattis and McMaster, Gary Cohn and Treasury kind of stayed on that line pretty respectably. I would defend them mostly for things they shouldn't have, but for what they did. But they were gone by about the end of 2019, except for Cohn. And Trump gradually realized that if he wanted to really do what he wanted to do, he needed much less formidable people who knew a lot and would stand up to him and had the self-respect to stand up to him. So someone like John Bolton, who I've known a long time, and I don't agree with on many some foreign policy issues, and he's a tough kind of guy, very conservative and all that. But John Bolton is a principled person. And when they came to him on the Ukraine impeachment stuff, remember John Bolton's the one who said to Fiona Hill, this is a drug deal. You can't do this. And you should go see the White House counsel. He said that to Alex Vindman and Eugene Vindman, and that's why they then, they're testifying and stuff. That Bolton could have been a little more courageous. He didn't testify before Congress and all this, so I have my issues with him too. But no John Bolton in the second term. No, none of these people. So that's, I think, very, and he's got a whole movement that's grown up at Heritage Foundation and elsewhere, people who are really eager for this kind of authoritarian playbook. Let's just, create Schedule F and put 50,000 civil service jobs at the president's discretion. We had that back in the mid-19th century, and it was infinitely smaller government at that point. And that's the way we got to crack down on these bureaucrats who slow things down. And all the Justice Department rules, Harry knows much more about this than I do, about not intervening in individual cases, criminal cases, and so forth, that Biden, to his credit, has pretty scrupulously followed, right? His Justice Department is prosecuting his son, and not the most obvious, honestly, kind of serious charges, maybe. Whatever. But Biden is that old-fashioned view, and certainly when I was White House Chief of Staff, you literally couldn't call the Justice Department. And if you got a call, you had to sort of go to your own counsel and say, this is a policy matter, I want to talk to them about what our position is on, civil justice reform or something like that. But I'm not going to, of course, I can't discuss a particular case. And we would always get asked, by people not seeking anything corrupt, but, I have a business, they're really harassing me in antitrust, they're wrong, can you step in and just make sure that it gets to the Attorney General's attention, because there's some deputy assistant Attorney General who's, got it in for us, and we couldn't, we didn't. Or we said you could write a letter to this person, but you communicate, right? So they're not going to do that behind the scenes or anything like that. That was pretty standard since Watergate. None of that. I mean, if you think Trump is going to obey any of that, and the appointees are going to obey any of that, and do we think a Republican House is going to have serious oversight of any of this? And they're probably going to win the Senate, so will the Republican Senate have serious oversight of this stuff? So suddenly you're really looking at a very different situation, I think, in terms of the rule of law, of all the norms that we've kind of come to take for granted. I mean, think of Watergate, but again, in Watergate, incidentally, why didn't it work for Nixon? It didn't work because actually Republicans in Congress wouldn't go along, because people in the government wouldn't go along, right? And they ended up blowing the whistle in various ways. And what Nixon did was honestly 1/10 of what he wants to do, right? I mean, really think about it. Why did Nixon have to resign? Because he bugged an opponent's office, basically, and then used the CIA in ways that were inappropriate domestically. But I mean, compared to what Trump would like to do, deporting 50 million people, prosecuting opponents of his, and the intimidation works. I would say that's the other thing. I've been struck talking to these business types, and they don't want to be in the crosshairs. And look, to be fair, if it's a publicly owned company, they have all kinds of obligations, share and stakeholders. And just because they don't like Trump, and they're going to make some statement that's going to hurt all their employees, and so everyone has this set of kind of I don't know, rationales, I would say, for not taking a Trump. Anyway, all the net effect of all of that is that he's a very dangerous person if he were to win. And again, the final point, this is the point Bob Kagan's made. Think about, if he wins, we haven't quite internalized this, I think. It will be a huge comeback. It will be one of the biggest stories in American political history. The guy won as an outsider in an upset, lost his re-election, January 6th, indicted for 4 separate crimes, convicted of 1, incidentally, and then he wins. He's going to be riding so high that it's sadly a fifth of the Democrats in Congress are going to have trouble standing up to him. If they're in a district or a state that has some Trump sympathy, the media is going to get worried, understandably, about licenses and things. I just think that the danger of Trump winning this time is great.
And where do the courts fit in?
I defer to you, and that's but no, but he's had 4 years of appointments.
Yeah.
We've seen what the Supreme Court did on the immunity case. I think not if the whole Supreme Court's corrupt. I don't think they'll give him everything. I hope they'll stand up to him the way that his own judges did, his own appointees did in 2020 when he tried to overturn the election. But there are in-between positions between really standing up to an overbearing president and total capitulation, and I think they're somewhere in between. The immunity decision is pretty hard for me to defend. And so I think of that. He's got apparently immunity from pretty much almost everything he would do. Some of that's going to spill over to his agents who do those things. You can't really say the president's immune, but someone who obeys the order of the president, you're going to arrest him. I don't think so. Who's going to arrest him? Trump's Justice Department is not going to. And Trump has said ahead of time he's going to pardon everyone. And he did pardon a lot of people in his first term in ways that, again, hadn't been done by anyone. There were some sleazy pardons, frankly, with Clinton and others. At the end of his term, some donors, some friends, relatives get pardoned a little bit, That's at the end of his term on the way out, and they get out of jail, and they don't go to jail or something like that. Trump pardoned people in the middle of serious investigations, Manafort and so forth, right? To stop them from talking, to give them an incentive, a reward for not talking. But now he's saying he's going to pardon all kinds of people in government, and incidentally, people outside of government. So if a mob assembles outside some liberal, or Planned Parenthood office somewhere, and they, get in a fight with, people there, or they try to shut it down, or something like this, and, some of the local police could go, depending on what state it is, could help the mob. And Trump could say, they're doing the right thing, and this is provoked by these left-wingers, George Soros, and I'm going to pardon those people, right? You really could have a situation where you have militias kind of, organizing themselves, working. Our law enforcement is very complicated in this country. The federal, so federalized, so decentralized that, you could have rogue elements there. And Trump promised he's already for unqualified immunity for cops, right? And I'm sympathetic to police, and I've always been kind of a law and order guy and all this. But the idea that you literally, what he's saying, as I understand it, is that the federal government would make it impossible to prosecute a policeman with anything, and that is like the immunity for the president And so every cop who, there are some bad apples and they do some very bad things. And what will it start to look like if they can't be prosecuted? Trump's pardoning other people, and you get militias sort of on the outside who are being encouraged by Trump to take things into their own hands. I mean, the historians of America have said if you want to think about really kind of worry, get scared, think of it's sort of the South with respect to blacks in the early 20th century. Governments that are bigoted, obviously, colluding with outside forces that take the law into their own hands. And, you get a real situation where people's basic civil rights may not be honored. Now, I still think we do have some guardrails. It's a big country, and luckily the federal government doesn't control everything. This is my old conservative side, where you don't really want a huge federal government. You want a lot of big institutions that are not controlled by the federal government, including state institutions. And you want state universities that don't get all their money from the federal government and don't answer to Trump. And you want religious institutions and community centers and all kinds of things that aren't too dependent and too much at the will and the beck and call of the federal government. And that's a very good thing about America. Trump announced the Muslim ban that first week he was in office in 2017. And I mean, literally, tens of thousands of lawyers volunteered and showed up at airports and really brought a million law cases that really threw sand in the gears of that. And by the time the sand got out of the gears, the momentum had gone, So we want to have a lot of independent centers of power in our country, and we do. So it's not Hungary, it's not Venezuela, it's not going to immediately become that. But the erosion that could happen to the rule of law and to civil liberties and the kind of nativism and the deportation stuff, I mean, I think that's very worrisome.
I'm scared. Let me ask you one final
very
question.
Very upbeat here.
Yeah.
As John McCain, who was my favorite politician of my 40 years in Washington, used to like to say, it's always darkest before it turns pitch black.
And that's actually a very good segue to my final question to you, because, all right, let's assume for the moment, you mentioned McCarthy, and this is what brings this up to me. McCarthy had this absolutely deflating moment, at long last, sir, have you no decency, and he was done. Let's say Trump loses. The party has been so recast in his image. What's your vision of, Trumpism after Trump? Even assuming he's off the scene, it's been, the Republican Party is unrecognizable, right?
Yeah, and one reason a lot of us were against Trump, people say, well, you just don't like the tweets, and he's vulgar, and he's, kind of buffoonish and rude, but come on, and how serious is it? But once certain norms get destroyed, other norms get established. It's like the toothpaste is out of the tube, right? It's a little hard. It's hard to get it back. And there are a lot of young politicians, a lot of people in quote journalism, a lot of people on social media certainly, who are used to operating, let's say, in a Trumpist environment. So Trump could lose and he could retire. First, he could lose and he could still say, I still want to be in charge of the Republican Party. Yeah. And I don't know, are we confident that he won't? If Trump loses by 3-4 points, just like 2020, let's say. And we think there's a primary for governor of Virginia in 2025, which there would be, or in many states in 2026. Do we think the Trumpist candidate or the anti-Trump or the non-Trumpist candidate would be favored in most Republican primaries? I'm not so confident that Trump doesn't still have a huge power in the party. Say nothing of all of his lackeys and the wannabe Trumps who would then emerge and become very powerful. So on the one hand, I'm pessimistic that everything snaps back. I'm very pessimistic that the Liz Cheneys of the world really have any future in the Republican Party. I think it's possible, and this would be good. I mean, these aren't my favorite people, but that the Glenn Youngkins of the world, and the Brian Kemps of the world, the governors of Georgia and Virginia, who haven't been as Trumpy, could they navigate, Nikki Haley maybe, I think she was too hostile to Trump, could they navigate a Republican Party that you end up in 2028 with a sort of people who accommodated Trump more than someone like me would have liked, but who aren't, full on. We're not talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tucker Carlson or Lauren Boebert or, Elise Stefanik or J.D. Vance, though are we talking about them? I mean, don't J.D., think of that, 2028. I don't know, who's more likely to be the Republican nominee, J.D. Vance and on the one hand, or Tucker Carlson on the one hand, or who? I don't know, Glenn Youngkin, let's just say, governor of Virginia. on the other. I don't know. I'm not so confident that the Trumpism doesn't remain pretty strong. But having said that, there's also a fair amount of evidence in history that, the original demagogue is the strongest. I mean, a lot of this is personal. It's a cult, right? It's Trump. And if he leaves the scene, you'll get fighting among the Trump supporters. They'll all want DeSantis, who will fight with, I don't know, J.D. Vance, who will fight with Elise Stefanik, and they'll all want to be number one. And, they'll each have their own little versions of Trumpism, and some of them were actually okay on helping Ukraine, and other ones are not so crazy on some other issues. So I think the disarray of Trump world would help probably mitigate the danger. And I think over time, things could get better. But I don't think you get an immediate snapback. And so I think you still have, I think a lot would depend on what happens. I mean, these things are not, you mentioned earlier, but it's a good thing to close on. When I got involved in politics, and it was different from intellectual life, people like to have intellectual discussions. I get asked this all the time, with the future of the Republican Party, who could reshape it. It's going to be reshaped by what happens in actual Republican primaries, right? I mean, if any anti-Trump Republicans could win a Republican primary, I'm doubtful about that, that would be a big deal. If some not so Trumpy Republicans could win a Republican primary, that would be a big deal in House or Senate or governor. If the Republican Party in California and other states could veer away from Trumpy craziness and put in some people who are wary of the Trump stuff, even if they're not really anti-Trump, that would be a big deal. So there'll be a lot of fights in 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028 within the Republican Party that will resolve this. It's not going to be resolved by me writing an article about what the party should look like or anyone else honestly doing it. I do think the pick of Vance was finally that was important because it really, it makes the authoritarianism of the second term much more real. Vance is a smart guy, and he really believes a lot of this stuff. I think now he didn't once, and I think he and others will really, they're going to block the McManuses and the McMasters and the other people who checked, Trump and Trumpism. They're going to insist on their kinds of people being in there. So it's danger in terms of actual governance. But also, if Trump loses a close race, and he might run again, of course, but even if he doesn't, I don't know, Vance will be there as the VP candidate. People like me think he's pretty appalling. But I don't know, we don't know what his numbers among Republicans aren't that bad. And let's see how he does, and maybe he'll do well in the VP debate. He's not a dumb guy. And suddenly he becomes sort of the leading candidate for 2028. So I think it would be much better if Trump loses, and I think it's a little unpredictable. These things, Trump's rise was unpredictable, maybe the fall of Trumpism will be unpredictable. But I'm slightly pessimistic about the party coming to its senses kind of right away. I'm optimistic, on the other hand, as an ex-Republican, moderately optimistic about the Democratic Party, which from my point of view, which is I would like to have a reasonably hawkish and moderate and pro-business in appropriate ways Democratic Party, not too woke, little woke. Someone described me as this joke, it's sort of, attacks on me as woke Bill Kristol, and I think I'm half woke, third woke.
Wokey.
Yeah, exactly, neo-woke or something. But I feel like in Virginia, where I live, Abigail Spanberger probably is going to be the Democratic nominee, and I think can win the governorship. Mikey Sherrill, who served as a Navy helicopter pilot for 20 years, could be the governor of New Jersey. A lot of the younger members, Jimmy Panetta and others, are very impressive members of Congress. Some of them are veterans. A lot of them are not, far left Democrats. This is a big Fox talking point. They're all like AOC or, Omar or something. They're not mostly like that. Some of them are a little more timid in taking on the left than they should be. But, Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro and Jared Polis, Newsom's a little more complicated, but I defer to you on him. But I find him so off-putting because he's such a smoothie, So I suspect he's probably not as bad a governor as people say. He's not a stupid guy. Anyway, but if you look at some of these governors, I'd say especially Shapiro, Whitmer, Polis, and some of the others, Cooper in North Carolina, if you look at some of these younger members of the House especially, some of the ones in the Senate, it's not that, I'm more hopeful about the moderate, centrists of the Democratic Party than I ever thought I would be. And I think that's the future for people like me who, ex-Republicans, we can be for the more moderate. And look, Kamala Harris, just to close on that, obviously, I mean, her speech at the Democratic Convention was really remarkable. I mean, in the sense of being, it wasn't, some of it was political positioning, but some of it was pretty serious, you know. I mean, they are pro-aid for Ukraine. They are not anti-military. They are they're proud of America. They acknowledge correctly that we have problems and sins in our past and some of them persist. But there's none of that. I mean, if you look at Harris's speech and compare it with a normal, if I can put it that way, Democratic speech of the last 20 or 30 years, there's much, much less of the breastfeeding, and we apologize for all these things in our history, and we really have to repent for those, and it's terrible. And instead, we're proud of our history. We need to do some things better. We need to move forward further. But I feel like that was an important moment. I think that speech. Politically, will it work? I don't know. It's such a weird race against Trump, but I do think it was important for the future of the Democratic Party.
Bill Kristol, thank you so much, not just for your clear-eyed analysis, but for your fidelity to the Constitution and democratic values these many years. Long may you wave.
Thank you for tuning in to One on One, a weekly conversation series from Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Talking Feds remains one of the very few independent productions out there, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Plus, you'll get tons of perks like free access to my LA Times op-eds and the chance to join monthly live Q&A sessions. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds One-on-One is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McCarty, Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mehendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Genesis Magpayo. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.